theory has to have a priority.
Capitalism and artificial intelligence are the same thing.
The dimension of the future has disappeared.
There is actually no representation anymore.
There is no final resolution to contradiction.
Militant proletarian snake handling over abysses never gets much wilder than this.
All right, everybody, welcome back to The Dangerous Maybe. And today, Nance and I are joined by somebody we have been wanting to talk to again for a very long time. We are so happy to be joined by Benjamin Studebaker. And we are going to be discussing his first book, a classic, The Chronic Crisis of American Democracy, The Way is Shut. Also, we will be discussing his second book, Legitimacy and Liberal Democracies. The focus will be the first book, but we'll tell you about the second one in a minute. Benjamin, it's great to have you here. But before we get into it, Nance, what's up?
Oh, just hanging out. We've been jamming.
We've been jamming. I gave everybody a little
Mikey,
hint about who the special guest was on Instagram. I was like, yeah, like Bob Marley, we've been jamming.
The reason we're going to talk, mainly about the chronic crisis, the way it's shut. I think it's a very important book. I think it has kind of really informed my ideas and Mikey, our ideas on politics, and really kind of shown itself in some of our conversations, especially one of our recent conversations that I'm sure we'll get to in this discussion. But also Legitimacy and Liberal Democracies, the paperback, is heading to a bookshelf at the store near you, dear reader. So if you haven't had an opportunity to pick it up, now is a perfect time to do so.
Benjamin, welcome to The Dangerous Maybe. It is great to have you here. And tell everybody first and foremost what's going on with the second book. Let's focus on that for a minute.
Yeah, thank you guys for having me on. It's great to be back talking to you guys after too long of not doing it. The second book, Legitimacy and Liberal Democracies, which is my Edinburgh University Press book, it's coming out in paperback at the end of May, and it's going to be really cheap. It's going to be less than $25. If you buy it in the UK, it's going to be less than 20 quid. It's going to be really, really cheap. And my books are usually too expensive. And this paperback is going to be the deal that people who have followed my work have been waiting for a while. So I am really enthusiastic to tell people about it.
All right. So, I was checking it out today. I should have written this down. What's the exact day the paperback comes out, Benjamin? It's
the 31st, May
30...
31st. You can pre-order it right now and get that price.
I saw that on Amazon today. So, guys, get you a copy of Benjamin's second book. It is it'll change your life if you're into political theory and trying to think through the deadlocks of our current situation. I think you are just among the very best, if not the best, of thinking through the systematic deadlocks that our situation is comprised of. And look, us as inspired by Žižek, we often talk about the deadlocks and all this kind of thing. But what you do, especially like in the first book, what I love about it so much is like, it's not like, oh, we're stuck in deadlocks. It's like, no, let's actually think through each of these main deadlocks And I've never seen anybody do it with as much rigor and nuance as you did it. And so that to me is why your first book is just a, a classic in political theory. And that's what we're here to discuss today. And so, I mean, Benjamin, I think it would help just to start, you know, giving the audience some context here. I mean, look, we all feel that American democracy is stuck in some kind of chronic crisis and the way is shut. But can you kind of, before we get into the specific deadlocks and all this, like, why, generally speaking, are we stuck in a way that seems like there's no way forward?
Yeah. So the chronic crisis is this idea that you can be in a crisis that goes on for a really long time if the way in which you would typically get out of a crisis seems to be unacceptable outside the box of activity. So a lot of the time in political theory, if people become dissatisfied with the form of government, they change it to something else. But if you're convinced that all of the alternatives to democracy are really terrible, they're fascism, they're state communism, they're some kind of totalitarian thing, then you can't get out of democracy and exit to some other system in response to dissatisfaction with it. However, you're still really dissatisfied with it. It's not the same as simply being happy with the system that you have. So, I imagine a situation where people want to change what democracy means, but they don't want to abandon it. So they get into a long term struggle over the meaning of democracy, and the arguments about what it means become very acrimonious, very polyvalent. They can't be resolved because you can't actually change the democracy in such a way that it actually becomes satisfying as a form of regime. So you just invent numerous different ways of talking about it, none of which actually solve the concrete problem, which is that democracy can't manage what I call the unsolvable problem. The unsolvable problem is linked to capital mobility. It's become really easy to move wealth all over the world, but democracies are territorial nation states. They only have the ability to govern what is inside their territory. And as soon as something goes outside their territory, it's much harder for them to touch it. They have ways of influencing what goes on outside their territory with their militaries or with trade policy, but it's much more indirect, it's much more expensive, it's very hard for states to influence stuff outside their territory, especially if they have to cross water to influence it. It gets really, really challenging. And there's all of this kind of stopping power effect of trying to influence things that happen very far away from your core territory. So as it becomes easier to move wealth from place to place, the territorial nation state loses its leverage over wealth, and then it has to start trying to persuade wealth to visit it by offering wealth increasingly friendly conditions. So you say to money, if you come here, you won't be taxed. If you come here, you won't have to turn into high wages for workers. If you come here, there won't be regulations on what you can do. You'll be able to operate however you want to operate. There's a kind of race to the bottom effect of that. And lots of people want to use the state, use nation state democracy to solve this problem. But nation state democracy is territorial. So nation state democracy is not able to deal with these very rapid changes in the flows of wealth. And if you disrupt the flows, if you try to shut down trade and make it much harder for stuff to move from place to place, it destroys the economy and makes you extremely unpopular. So you can't govern it, you can't stop the flows, you are stuck in this policy straitjacket that gets tighter and tighter over time.
Okay, tell me if I'm understanding you right. So, Nick Land, who's big influence on us, he's always talking about the escape of capital, which is the escape of, capital being able to be controlled specifically by nations, right? So it seems like what we're talking about is this kind of international escape of capital has made it where national democracies have to, out of necessity, become the cucks of capital.
Yeah,
There's
they
no other
have to.
option.
They have to. Unless there's something that disrupts the mobility will tend to, it has a tendency to increase over time. And the more the mobility increases, the less leverage the territorial state has. Larger states that have more market share can avoid confronting this reality for a longer period of time. They have more images of being able possibly to influence events. You've seen over the course of the last year, the Trump administration has tried very hard to use the massive size of the American state to try to influence international trade with unilateral action. But it's very difficult, even for a relatively powerful state, to make other states in other parts of the world conform to its preferred trade policy, its preferred monetary policy, and attempts to internationally bring states together and get them to sign up to common arrangements like the WTO, like the European Union. These things are very fraught. It's very difficult to have very demanding rules that are enforced by these different mechanisms. Indeed, the whole Trump trade war thing got started with the United States becoming discontented with the way the World Trade Organization regulates trade. The Obama administration started obstructing the reappointment of members of the WTO appellate body who ruled against the United States. And then the Trump administration escalated that to refusing to allow anybody to be appointed to the WTO appellate body, to cause it to shut down and to be unable to hear trade disputes, in the hopes that this would then force states to negotiate directly with the United States in a bilateral arrangement where the United States would have more leverage. Even with all of that, it's a quite sophisticated strategy for trying to make states do what you want. It's still the case that the United States is not powerful enough to be able to make all of the other countries all around the world trade with it in the way that it wants, tax stuff at the rates that it wants, regulate the production of goods in the way that it wants. The nation state, it's too small.
So, okay, if the unsolvable problem is the escape velocity of capital, where again we mean by that the capital's escape from national control, does the Marxists have a point when they say that the only way to combat the internationalism or globalism of capital is a new international solidarity among nations? Or is there some kind of deadlock with that? Which, because it seems like, I mean, look, it's an easy answer in the sense of like, if that's what it would take, okay, it's easy to figure that out. It's not easy to pull that off. But if we could pull it off, is that really all it would take to get control of capital once again?
Yeah, so what goes wrong with internationalism? One is that people want internationalism to still be democratic. It's very difficult to argue that there's a global demos that operates in a democratic way. Usually, as people start to try to create international structures, these structures lose their appearance of being democratic and come to appear technocratic or even globalist, totalitarian, extremely oppressive. Right? The structures that were created to try to make it easier to manage, things like the WTO, the European Union, these things not only don't appear to give democracies control over capital, they're often framed, and not implausibly, as tools for further strengthening the power of capital by disabling individual nation states from taking independent measures that would be stronger than those instituted by the EU or instituted by the WTO. And then if you try to do it at the level of, okay, maybe we run candidates for elections in different nation states, and these candidates are committed to deviating from the current international order, replacing it with something else. And, people like Varoufakis talk about doing this from the left, or there have been various right-wing populists who have talked about doing this from the right. What tends to happen? Firstly, if you get elected, because the elections of all the nation states are on different timelines, most of the time when you win, there's no one else around who's interested in doing what you're looking to do. So if you nonetheless try to move ahead unilaterally alone with nobody else, you have a less competitive economic policy for attracting wealth if you do that, and the wealth runs away from you, and you get a run on the bond market or a run on the currency, right? And if you wait until other people win elections so that you can all move together at the same time, what will usually happen is that you will look feckless and useless during the interval in which you're waiting because you won't accomplish anything for anybody. People will accuse you of being a traitor, even for not doing the things that you said you would do immediately. And so by the time other people win elections, you're gone. Or by the time other people are running campaigns in those elections, people are saying, look at the other people who have talked about doing this stuff. They never accomplish anything. So why would you think that they would accomplish anything if they were elected here? So if you stay within the democracy box and each nation state has its own elections on its own schedule, you never get enough elections all won by the people who understand the problem in the same way, such that they can come together and take a united stance. And if you try to get away from the electoral mechanism, then you seem to be trying to move outside of the democracy box. And if you try to move outside the democracy box, then you appear to be doing something authoritarian, totalitarian, unacceptable, likely to produce a disaster. So this is how we get boxed out from both ends. And then there seems to be no alternative. And you seem to just have to do whatever kind of policy will attract wealth to your country.
Okay. I have some places I would like to take up a Nance. What are you thinking?
I just listened to the first maybe 66% of Joe Rogan had Mark Andreessen on recently. And I despise Mark Andreessen. I think he's one of the worst. But in that conversation, there were a few moments where Mark Andreessen was, I think, hoodwinking Joe, and Joe just went along with it because he doesn't know any better, and he's just riding his wave of success. I don't hate Joe Rogan. I rather like Joe Rogan, and I listen to him regularly. But I hate a lot of his guests. And Mark Andreessen was explaining to Joe why semiconductors are manufactured in Taiwan. And he was talking about environmental regulation, and he was talking about he made the case that it's rather hard for capital to flee because when you leave America, you have to pay an exit tax and blah blah blah. But he made this whole kind of confabulated fairy tale that Joe bought kind of hook, line, and sinker. And I mean, here in Arizona, semiconductor manufacturing was part of the industry. Even in my youth, like I remember being a kid, my dad worked at multiple factories, Motorola and Rogers Corporation. When they outsourced all the jobs and they shut everything down, my dad got laid off. So I remember living through this. But the fairy tale that Mark Andreessen, this billionaire investor guy, this venture capitalist, and then they talked about the Mr. Wonderful, the Utah data center that everyone's going on and on about, and it seems to be the case that no one has good information on it. People are just talking about it because it's a compelling narrative. And they were talking about tax breaks, and Utah can offer tax breaks to entice these people to come here and then create jobs. And I think Kevin O'Leary went on Tucker Carlson, and Tucker was trying to undermine Kevin O'Leary. All of it. It was all rather silly. Like from my perspective, you have these billionaires weaving these yarns about how what they're doing is actually good for democracy. Like they were telling this story of how, no, it's actually good for America. We're actually being patriotic. And it was actually because the liberals did their environmental regulation is why we outsourced all our manufacturing overseas and all that stuff. And it's all absurd. And I'm not saying that the liberals have the answers. I think overregulation is just as problematic as total deregulation. But the thing that struck me is they are appealing to democracy, Kevin O'Leary and Mark Andreessen, and they're appealing to this idea of Americanness. And what is America? Well, we're free. We have liberty. We have democracy. So they're taking examples of failure of the system to regulate and control capital and keep capital in check. That it's pretty easy to understand. American industry crumbled because the business people didn't want to pay Americans because they could pay people elsewhere less. And like, that's why industry crumbled. But it was just interesting how they spun that whole tale, all the while appealing to democracy. Like democracy and liberty and freedom and patriotism is always this thing that we have to always honor and always respect. And you have people who want to overregulate and make it difficult to do business, who appeal to democracy. And then you have people who want to totally deregulate and make it impossible to do business because it's just, there's no reason to stay there because capital is no longer attracted because it's too hard to make money. But everybody is appealing to democracy all the while.
Is this the ideological appeal to democracy in order to conceal the crisis of democracy?
Yeah, that's exactly it. Like it's if they would have just read The Way Is Shut, like if Joe Rogan would just read The Way Is Shut, I don't think he would be so credulous. I don't think he would let Mark Andreessen get away with the things he was saying. And I don't know, that's a fun fantasy now, having Joe Rogan reading The Way Is Shut.
Yeah.
I mean, what do you think, Benjamin, about like how, like these ideological appeals to democracy seem to conceal the traumatic failure of it?
Yeah, if you operate from the premise that the level of capital mobility that we have in the neoliberal era is permanent and natural and you can't change it, then it would seem to be the case that democracy always has to operate in something like this ecosystem, and therefore the competitive pressures that situation creates and the restraints that creates in terms of democratic policymaking are just part of what democracy is. What they do is they treat the level of capital mobility that exists now and has broadly existed for maybe the last 30, 40 years, although even over the course of that period, it has continued accelerating. They treat that as if it's the natural state of affairs and not something anybody can revise or change. Back in the post-war era, there was a lower level of capital mobility than there is now for a number of reasons. One is that we hadn't yet created the World Trade Organization, so trade barriers were a lot higher than they used to be. Another is that a lot of countries were not developed. So a lot of countries didn't have the capacity to produce industrial goods. They didn't have a workforce that was able to produce industrial goods or the infrastructure necessary to do that. So they couldn't compete for manufacturing jobs. Another is that industrial engineering used to be a lot more primitive. So it was actually much more expensive and difficult to pick up and move a factory from one place to another. It took a longer period of time. You lost more money doing it. And another is that it used to be that it took a very large number of workers that you had to assemble over a long period of time to be able to run one of these factories. These days, there's a ton of countries that are all trying to produce. And they all have labor forces that can do industrial production, and they all have infrastructure that can do industrial production. And the number of workers that you need to run a factory efficiently is much lower than it used to be because of the degree to which the technology has developed. And the industrial engineering makes it much quicker to respond to pressure by moving. Now, of course, they'll still emphasize the ways in which they are restrained. The restraints that they face in terms of it still takes, maybe a year to pick up and move a lot of plants. Some plants in more sophisticated industries like semiconductors, it still takes a significant unit of time to move them from one place to another. And this gives the workers in these kinds of industries still a little bit of leverage. But the sectors where the workers have real leverage of the kind that people used to have back in the 70s, it's a very, very narrow number of sectors now and getting narrower all the time. And the thing people have to remember is that even in the 70s, when this technology was much more primitive and the WTO didn't yet exist, we just had GATT. The labor unions, when they tried to resist the pressure coming from the IMF to, in European countries like the UK, cut the social services, get rid of these expensive mining jobs, the labor unions tried really hard to fight those policies and lost and got waxed in the 70s and 80s when all of this was at a much more primitive level than it now is. And now the labor union rate in the United States is about half of what it was in 1980.
Okay, so I mean, here's one aspect of this I think is interesting and operating in the background, because you listed these different factors of why, you know, in the post-war era it was easier to kind of have a kind of homeostatic synergy between liberal democracies and capitalism, right? There were these barriers or restraints, these structural restraints where capital couldn't just go elsewhere whenever it wanted, right? Could we also say that one of these factors was just the Eastern Bloc itself? And in a weird way, the Eastern Bloc was a necessary condition of the functioning of Western post war economies?
Absolutely. The Eastern Bloc was a set of states that were not integrated into the global system of trade. There was some interaction. It's not as if there was no economic interaction at all or no financial interaction at all, but there was much less interaction than, say, exists today between the United States and China, or even between the United States and Russia today, right? Much less interaction during the Cold War. And then also there was all this concern that people might actually choose to leave democracy and adopt some sort of communist regime. And if not people in the United States, then perhaps people in other countries around the world, post colonial countries, European countries. And so, therefore, there was this political concern to make concessions on the basis of preventing regime change. If you're no longer willing to do regime change because you've decided that all alternatives to democracy are totalitarian and unacceptable, then your leverage is very much restricted. All you can do in response to not being able to get what you want is vote differently. When you try to use the strike, they crush the strikers. They've been repeatedly crushing the strikers. And the reason that labor unions aren't radical in the way that they used to be is that it doesn't seem to be reasonable to people who have experience in labor unions to use those kinds of strategies, because they're familiar with the history of using those strategies and what has happened under the conditions that have prevailed over the last 50 or 60 years when people try that stuff. It's not that people just became stupid and unable to strategize in the way that they did in the first half of the 20th century. Indeed, the labor unions became the way that they are because people saw the writing on the wall in terms of what you could do. Now, once the labor unions don't win as much, then people feel less compulsion to join them. And so they shrink. And then as they shrink, they become weaker still. And then they win less. And then people feel less compulsion to join them. Recently, there's been all this talk about the labor union being reborn. But if you look at the statistics, it's not any kind of sizable percentage of the US population joining labor unions. The labor union participation rate isn't up. It's not up at all. In fact, it's under 10% now.
Okay, just to bring it back for a second, I just love being able to say the post war, the good old days of the America that we want to make great again, brought to you by the Eastern Bloc. Like I just want to be able to say that. But no, I mean that's dialectics, right? That's the power of dialectical thinking, where you think a thing in terms of the very thing that it stands in contradiction to, and you realize no, the thing that it's opposed to, the antagonist, actually makes possible the very protagonist. Um,
And that
or
goes on
yeah,
today with China. China was brought into the first world system in the 70s, and then loads and loads of jobs could be moved to China. And China, this, communist alternative that people frame it as, actually facilitated and fueled neoliberalism in the West by being this other place where you could manufacture cheaply. And China got very rich from playing this specific role, which was essential in crushing the labor movement and in crushing the workers' movement in the West.
yeah. Okay, so I want to come back to unionization, but I think kind of to help build context and build the conceptual framework. So the book is about the chronic crisis of American democracy, but in it, you start examining the issue of legitimacy, which in your second book, you build into its own book. So the unsolvable problem is the mobility of capital, the escape velocity of capital, the international or global escape of capital. But another fundamental crisis is that of legitimacy. Can you maybe tie that in because it's such an important concept for you?
Yeah, so legitimacy is to do with whether people endorse or at least accept with some reluctance the political system. political systems can't survive if they don't have any legitimacy, because if they have no legitimacy at all, then people won't cooperate with the decisions, right? States will say, you have to do this, you have to do that, you can't do this, you can't do that. If there's no legitimacy at all, then you'll ignore the things that the state tells you to do, and then the things that it tells you to do won't be functional. They won't actually produce a result, right? If there's a total lack of legitimacy, if there's none, then there's a breakdown in order. People don't even follow, laws to do with not assaulting or killing each other. You get a total disaster if there's absolutely no legitimacy. That's a failed state. That's a real proper disaster. However, oftentimes in the history of thinking about legitimacy, people act like it's either something you have none of or something that you have all of. And if you had unlimited legitimacy, you can imagine a situation where people agree with everything that happens, everything that the state does. They don't feel any level of alienation from. They endorse it. They're fine with it. It comes out through a democratic process. They can endorse it, right? A step down from that is to say that you don't like some of the things that the state does, but you still endorse the procedures by which it comes to the decision. So you might say, okay, I like democracy. I don't like the specific way the Congress voted, the specific law they passed. I don't like the specific person who won the presidential election, but I'm committed to the procedure by which those people were picked. And therefore, I'm going to be a good loser about it, and I will try again next time. My argument is that we can no longer reach that level of legitimacy. However, we also never sink to the level of rejecting the state and its order and trying to overthrow it. We instead operate in this very miserable space that I call minimal legitimacy, where we say, well, it has to be a democracy, but I don't like any of the rules by which this specific democracy operates. The electoral law, the laws, in terms of the three branches of government, the role of the courts, the relationship between the nation state and international institutions, all of these things are unacceptable. So all of the decisions that are being taken are unacceptable because they come out of unacceptable procedures. However, the critique of the procedures always stops short at overthrowing democracy and the nation state as a system of government. All of the reforms that you propose have to be internal to that box and have to seem plausibly to still be inside it. And this puts you in a situation where you can never actually break the thing and replace it with something else. But also, you can never feel good about it. And you never get to a point where you're not expressing symptoms of your resentment. And I borrow a concept from the philosopher Bernard Williams of reasonable resentment. Reasonable resentment is what you feel when you're disidentified with the actions of a powerful person. Yeah, that you're subject to these actions, you can't do anything about them, you don't agree, you haven't been persuaded to endorse, you feel resentment that you're made to do something that you don't agree with, but this resentment is reasonable because nobody persuaded you. You were never actually convinced. And as this reasonable resentment intensifies beyond a certain limit, it produces a terrible stuckness in which people are extremely unhappy. And this is the chronic crisis, this terrible stuck unhappiness, which in my second book becomes the tar pit that the hydra of the state is trapped in.
That's great. Yeah, I mean, look, I think this question of legitimacy, I mean, I think it connects to this another aspect of your analysis, which is false hope. Also, like it's like, see, false hope kind of acts as maybe a counter to this looming disillusionment we have with authority or authoritative institutions. Um, I mean, look, Žižek is famous for talking about the decline of paternal authority. And, there's people who react viscerally to that, where it's like, we shouldn't have paternal authority. But what he's trying to get at is the decline of legitimate authority. And people can go, well, there shouldn't be any authority at all. But then, like, you as a pragmatic political thinker, you're sitting there going, yeah, that doesn't actually work well either. It's good to always be able to step back and challenge your presuppositions, but if nobody has any, like, meaningful respect for the structure of their society, yeah, it's like it's hard for us to imagine a thriving citizen in that dynamic.
Yeah, it becomes unhealthy. Too much or too little legitimacy both become unhealthy. You need this productive tension. But if you don't have the threat of having no legitimacy at all, then it very much limits how you respond as the amount of legitimacy you have declines. Because if the state knows it will never drop to zero, then the state has this ability to continue persisting with behavior that you don't like without fear of what you will do. In the post-war era, there was terrible fear of what you would do. Would you do a communist revolution if they made you upset enough? Would you become a fascist if they made you upset enough? Now, nobody really believes, although people pretend all the time that they believe, nobody really believes that the people who are upset are going to do communism or fascism.
They're
And
just going to
insofar as they
tweet.
talk about it, right?
Yeah.
Insofar as they talk about it, it's to discipline you into voting for their people, because if you believe that somebody else is trying to do authoritarianism, that's what will get you to continue to vote for the status quo.
Yeah. Nance, what were you going to say?
I just on the authority thing, Netflix just released a Lord of the Flies movie, and I watched the first like 15 minutes of it, and the cinematography is not good. I couldn't watch it.
I just saw it, and Sam, my fiance, had the same reaction to it. She hated the cinematography. She thought it was so pretentious, the fishbowl lens thing.
Yeah, it was hard. But imagine a world with no authority. You get a bunch of, schoolboys on an island. Yeah, we need authority. And politically, I don't know, I'm some kind of anarchist. And even I defend authority in the form of prohibition. Like there's just things that you cannot do, that not even that you shouldn't do, but that you cannot do. Like there is a limit. And it doesn't have to be kind of dressed up as moralism. It doesn't have to be heavy-handed or anything like that. But like, yeah, you can't have a functioning society if you're all taking LSD and running around on diapers and licking each other's belly buttons.
Yeah, anarchism at its best works on the premise that everybody can think, everybody can respond to reasons, everybody is able to interface with some notion of good versus bad. Where anarchism breaks down is when people claim, no, there's actually some basis for irrationality, or there's some fundamental communication problem that means that you can't trust human rationality.
Yeah.
No, I like how you describe it, Benjamin, though. It's almost like we're invoking the Aristotelian doctrine of the mean when it comes to this, where, if it's like, oh, society can do nothing right or it can do nothing wrong, that both of those are problems. And the way the terminology I would invoke here is, to talk like, he gets it from Heidegger and Wittgenstein, but Lee Braver, he wrote a book called Groundless Grounds, and it had a big impact on me. And so the person who just has total faith in the structure of the society, they take it like it's just an immovable, absolute ground. It's just an absolute foundation. There's nothing wrong with it. There's nothing to be improved. But then you have the kind of the nihilist thing, which is just everything is groundless. Nothing has any foundation. Everything is contingent, blah, blah, blah. But what Lee Braver says is like, no, there are groundless grounds, which is this kind of middle zone of saying, no, we have to have foundations. We have to have grounds, but we also have to be strong enough and courageous enough to say, but they are contingent, but they're necessary. And because they're contingent, there's room for improvement, but we also have to understand that without them, it's worse. So it's almost like you're right. Like there's a certain way to properly position yourself to seeing authority as legitimate, right?
Yeah, I got an article that is going to be coming out later this year in the Australian Humanities Review about how you need either to be kind of settled on your procedures to question your mores, or you have to be settled on your mores to question your procedures. And you kind of have to switch which one is moving and which one is stable. And in this way, society and politics kind of switch off, which is taking the lead. Otherwise, you get stuck in something that doesn't move and which tries to simply dominate. You have to have some level of that push-pull in principles. And that comes out of a capacity to settle on something for a while and then revisit the fact that you settled on it and then reopen it at some later point.
That's really good. Okay, so let's get into the heart of all these deadlocks. Okay, so we're stuck dealing with this chronic crisis of American democracy, and lots of people want to put forth answers. They have the solutions to it. So one of the big divides, especially in Marxism, is to talk about reform versus revolution. So I guess we'll start with somebody who says, no, we can reform our way out. The way is not shut because reformism. What do you say to that, Benjamin?
So if you stay within the terrain of reformism, it typically means that you're staying within the terrain of the elections. And then you run into this problem of not being able to win enough elections fast enough in enough places. If you just think about the whole world, because it's an international economic system, the whole world has so many elections in it, and they occur at so many different times. People can see this in terms of US politics really easily. Each election, each federal election, you only have a third of the Senate that's up. So even if you do really, really well, you can't take over the Senate in a single US federal election. It requires that you be able to sustain momentum across 6 years to be able to contest every US Senate seat, right? And then governorships, they're all on different timetables. So if you're trying to get governors of different states to cooperate, totally different timetables. This all becomes much more complicated and even worse once you add in other democracies around the world that operate on different timetables. And then you even need the cooperation of non-democratic states. If you want to make the world really different through reform now, you would need the cooperation of the Chinese to do that. And if you don't have the cooperation of the Chinese, then there's going to be terrible economic instability in attempting to operate without them. We've been seeing a US president who doesn't even try to operate without the Chinese. He just tries to lead the thing without treating the Chinese as equals and as partners at every stage and at every step. And even that, really, really limits what you're able to do. And so then you have to have a working understanding of what's going on inside that country and how decisions are taken there. And that's much more opaque to us because unless you're reading Mandarin, it's very difficult to see. And because it's a one-party state that doesn't have a free society where there's a free and open conversation, even if you do read Mandarin, it's going to be really hard to figure out exactly what's going on inside there. And we've seen, how the Trump administration struggles to figure out what's going on within Iran. And that's a much smaller country, which is theoretically less complicated in terms of its economy. So all of these problems abound with reform, just in terms of getting enough people in enough places at one and the same time who see things in one and the same way. And one of the consequences of how difficult it is to win a large number of elections at one and the same time is that people's politics form in response to wildly different events. So each election, we have to argue about what's the important issue in this election? What's the thing that people care about? And depending on where you start from, this tends to give rise to whole different understandings of what the fundamental problem is and how you would change it. So for instance, in European politics, there was a refugee crisis, and it caused a ton of people in Europe to think that the fundamental problem was one of migration. And it takes years to figure out that that's not the case. Because first people have to win elections and then they have to try stuff, which treats this as the basic central problem. And then they have to discover what goes wrong when, there was a French guy recently who said that Brexit is a 30-year problem because it takes 10 years to recognize that it was a mistake, 10 years for the British political system to figure out a way to commit itself to rejoining the European Union or to taking a different course of action. And then another 10 years for the rest of the European Union to come around politically to finding a way to bring Britain back in. And that's just something basic, like whether the UK is in the European Union or not. And that by itself is not a strong enough mechanism to fundamentally change anything. That's just a small, little, tiny, dinky element in all of this.
And then this exists against the background of the timescales of both climate change and AI, which adds a whole nother dimension to this. So
yeah, democratic political time is not matched up at all now with the pace of modernization.
Mm-hmm. So you have the other side, which says, I want a revolution and I want it now. So can a revolution save American democracy?
So the problem that the revolution folks have is that if you're calling for a different system of government, you are immediately accused. And this even happens within our electoral politics. If someone just proposes reforms that you don't agree with, you accuse them of being a communist or a fascist in US politics, right? Let alone if you straightforwardly say, I don't want this kind of representative democracy, I want a different kind of system. There is enormous skepticism of this. And this enormous skepticism comes from the history of the 20th century, the things that people tried in the 20th century, and the ways that these experiments are perceived to have turned out. There is this weight of the world wars and the Cold War and the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany that sits on everything. And it makes it really difficult to advocate for a different political system and get any kind of traction with that. And again, there's the possibility that if you do have some kind of revolution, you struggle to export it. And this is what happened with the Soviet project, arguably. You know, people who defend the Soviet project will say, look, on a theoretical level, the Soviet project wasn't, badly thought through at the beginning. But then something went wrong, and they tell a story about where in the Soviet history things finally passed the point of no return.
Yeah, either Lenin died or, they have
yeah, and some of them are really out there, that Khrushchev ruined, it, or Stalin ruined it, or who, was it Gorbachev? Who ruined it? There's loads of arguments about it, right? The thing that gets overlooked in all of those debates is that what ruined the Soviet Union is the fact that the German Revolution never happened in 1919. What ruined the Soviet Union is that they couldn't actually get the revolution to happen in other countries. All of these revolutions, if they try to create a whole new economic system that has to prevail around the world, they have to be exported, which means they typically go through a period of militarization where they become optimized for military export. During that period, they have to become compatible with the military as a form of organization. And this causes them to become very hierarchical, very command oriented, very centralized. When you're competing in one territory with other territorial entities, the form the competition takes structures the way that you are. So, what people often accidentally do is they get out of commercial competition by embracing military competition, or they get out of military competition by embracing commercial competition. You could argue this is what Germany and Japan did in reverse, right? They stopped fighting and instead commercially competed. When you change the form of competition, you don't, by doing that, break out of this continuous back and forth that we've had over the last several hundred years between commerce and war. You just switch which one you're stuck in. And this just reveals a different kind of cage for you, one that, is a different flavor. Maybe it's one you haven't seen for a while or you don't have a living memory of. So it might seem attractive, but it doesn't ultimately get you out. The way that to get out would be to have to, you'd have to qualify both commercial and military competition at the same time so that people weren't making decisions based on what's competitive in war or what's competitive in business. And they could actually have some area of life in which decisions were taken outside of those two logics. It's extremely, extremely difficult to create that kind of space without very strong cooperative mechanisms that prevent people from bringing force or bringing the profit motive and the profit imperative into the space.
Okay. Well, then, okay. Then you have the view that activism can somehow, some way solve this problem. And by activism, I guess we can also mention localism or representationism, which is we need more representation for marginal identities, all this kind. So, what do you think of the kind of campus activist approach to trying to solve the problem.
A local entity has even less territory than a nation state. So it's even smaller. And then these competitive forces become even more strongly felt. Like, why did the Paris Commune fail? The Paris Commune failed because not only did it get into military competition with other territorial entities, but it did this as a city facing France. So it did it as an even smaller unit facing a unit that was comparatively much larger. Localism tends to get stuck not only in relitigating and failing to escape these competitive dynamics, but in doing it from an even smaller size that just gives you no space. To make small units work, you need the safety and security that's provided by the large unit. A large unit can take away that pressure so that the small unit is free to expend resources on other things. Like, what's the benefit of being in a large state? It's that you as a city don't have to provide a military and fight all of the neighboring towns. You don't have to spend resources on that. Now you have resources that are potentially free and available to spend on something else. But this is only the case if the large unit that you're part of doesn't take all of your stuff and centralize all of it in its metropole. If it doesn't do that and it actually empowers you to use the stuff, then the fact that you don't have to defend yourself from other neighboring cities and towns becomes a huge benefit, right? But if you become accustomed to, what do these large states do? They just centralize everything in Paris. They take everything to London. If you start to think like that, and if that seems to be the way it always goes, then you go, oh, I'd rather just have small states, and then we wouldn't have to give all of our resources to London and Paris. But what would actually happen if you did get a bunch of small states? Then those small states would get into security competition with each other. And then all of the resources would go to that instead. And that would be even worse. So the localism takes for granted the peace that the larger units create. And it has an understandable frustration and resentment of the degree to which the larger units impose on them the commercial competitive logic, right? The cities, the provincial and regional governments, they complain all the time about how they don't have the fiscal capacity to make investments in stuff that their citizens want. They don't have the latitude to change their trade rules with other external entities. They're forced to import stuff that they don't want to have to import, or to export stuff that they don't want to have to export. But they can't solve that problem by making themselves even smaller and giving themselves even less territory. That just exposes them to an even more intense level of competition that they can't control.
Okay. What about we need a the right kind of populism. The right kind of populist movement will do the trick. What's the problem with that?
People have been trying to do that for a while. Part of the trouble here is that there is actual fragmentation that goes on as the process of modernization unfolds. You get more and more differentiation, and this differentiation produces a greater variety of subjectivities and of different cultural attitudes. So the easy one that I like to point to a lot, that's really easy to spot, is the university educated part of the US population has increased from 5% in 1945 to almost 40% today, which means, back in the 40s, the university educated people understood that they were an elite minority and they couldn't possibly run everything themselves with no concern for the rest of the population. But if 40% of people go to the university, and a lot of them end up in shitty working class jobs, in my first book, I talk about fallen professionals, people who get a university degree, but they don't end up in a high status job because it's not possible to absorb 40% of the population into high status jobs, right? There aren't enough roles for that. Once that happens, what you do is you create two different working classes, one which has university socialization and the set of norms and attitudes that come from going through that, and another which hasn't gone to college and doesn't pick up that further set of social norms.
Mhm.
And this produces culture war problems and a tendency to understand the central problem in totally conflicting and contrasting ways. So populists end up trying to find ways to get people who have been constituted in different ways, who have work routines, day-to-day life routines, conversations, media diets that are very different, and nonetheless get them to all work together on the basis of floating signifiers, kind of open, empty concepts, hope, change, and sometimes people. Barack Obama, a kind of open person who could be anything, can be whatever you want. The problem with these figures is that once they get into office, they have to be something in particular. They can't be anything and everything to everyone forever.
They have
And
to
as
take
soon as
on
they do
determinacy.
something, right, as soon as you do something, once you do that, you alienate significant chunks of these people that you only united on the basis that they didn't know anything about you and didn't yet know what you were going to do. You unite them on the basis of ignorance rather than on the basis of their coming to a shared understanding of something true or good. And you conflate this ignorance with a shared understanding of something true or good. And then you tell anybody who doesn't participate in it that they're being ignorant. But really, what you're asking them to do is, on the basis of their ignorance, affirm blindly something that has yet to reveal itself to them. You do this with people over and over, they get wise to it. And this is why populism can't generate the same level of support that it used to generate. If you look at the approval numbers of people who use populist strategies, and this includes not just, right wingers, not just left wingers, it includes a lot of centrist technocrats who have picked up and used populist tactics to win elections. They can't get the same level of support that they got with these strategies 20 or 30 years ago. And the amount of time that people give them before deciding, you're just like all the others, gets shorter and shorter and shorter. So the honeymoon period keeps getting shorter and shorter. In political systems that allow parties to chuck the leader and replace them without an election, so like Westminster systems, parliamentary systems, they are flipping through leaders all the time now, because very quickly the brand empties out, becomes obviously meaningless, and then they go grab somebody else. They're doing it in the UK right now with Andy Burnham, trying to get Andy Burnham in to replace Keir Starmer because his brand has become totally empty and he's obviously not different from the rest. But they used to talk about Keir Starmer just the same way that they're talking about Burnham now. And the more times they do this, the less effective it becomes.
Okay. Before I go on, Nance, what are you thinking?
I mean,
the deadlocks are piling up.
Yeah. I mean, I remember Hope, the Hope poster with Obama. And there was, I don't know, there was a feeling, and the Shepherd Ferry poster, Hope. And it was like, this is a radical moment. This is important. But then if you like investigate, you try to peek behind the curtain, and there was no substance. And he like immediately betrayed whatever it was I thought we were getting. But then, like, upon reflection, he didn't promise anything. He literally, it was all just hope. Yes, we can. And this rhetoric of like, look how important and monumental this moment is. And I do think it is important that we elected a black president. I think him being well spoken and him being half white didn't hurt that. But he's still, his name is Barack. And he's from Chicago. I think it was a moment. I think there was something real there. But it was also just a lot of hot air. And for me, like that moment was heartbreaking. Like,
well, there's some to the symbolism, but the politics is the issue, right?
Yeah. And like when I was when I was a teenager, I didn't care about politics at all. And then like it just so happened right around the time I was a young adult, Barack Obama, he was the new hotness. And I was like, okay, I'm a father, I have a job, I'm responsible. Maybe I should take this idea of participating as a citizen seriously. And so I did get really excited for Obama. And then within 6 months or a year, it like ripped my heart out. It was heartbreaking. And maybe I've never recovered from that. Maybe that's why it's so hard for me to even think about politics, and why to this day I think the Democrats lose on purpose with Bernie and with Kamala and with Hillary and all that. Like I think they bungled that intentionally. Because they wanted to keep giving themselves excuses to fail. They don't want anything to happen, because it is the capitalists who are running the show. It is money that's really running the show. And that's not to say all politicians are fake. I think there's probably a lot of good people who really care and who really do believe in the system and who really do want change. But the system itself doesn't want change, because the system is no longer a democracy. The system is no longer a national government. That's been subsumed by capital. Capital is this global machine that relies on communist China to produce cheap goods, so European and American consumers can continue to purchase goods, so they will go to work to continue to produce, it's the pyramid. But yeah, it like politics, it's just bullshit from my perspective. And then you kind of come along and explain it is bullshit, but you back it up and you're like, no, here is why it's bullshit. Here is why it's bullshit. Here is why it's bullshit. But that doesn't mean we should give up on ideas of the future and emancipation and this and that. And I think that's just as important as recognizing it's bullshit. And I even like, some of your strategies. Non-reformist reforms are I think that's a really good idea. But yeah, I really appreciate this deconstruction of politics, because it, not to say it validates my position, but it makes me feel less guilty, because like there is a guilt that I feel for just unplugging from politics totally. But it is also true. No, voting for your democratic socialist whatever is probably not going to do what they're telling you it's going to do. Like, you're probably not going to accomplish revolution, comrade, just by going out and rallying harder and voting harder and this and that. Like, we really do need to cope with the fact that we're up against the global machine of capital. It's not, oh, my local politicians are assholes, or it's not, oh, my state politicians are assholes, and it's not even my national politicians are assholes. I mean, I can dislike Donald Trump for all the reasons I choose. I can also maybe admire him for some things. I don't know, and which I don't, but looking at like structural systemic reasons for why we are in these deadlocks, I think it's far more important and far more productive than either continuing to play along and continuing to go to the rallies and go to the Marxist book clubs, and just try to perform the revolutionary subject harder, because that's not doing anything for anybody. And in fact, I think it's generating more kind of resentment at the local level. When I go out and perform the radical leftist, people in my neighborhood, that generates resentment, because they don't want to see some radical leftist in their neighborhood, because they're just trying to work. They're just trying to feed their kids and live their lives, and they want to be left alone. Yeah, I think this is a far better approach to politics than what's on offer today for most people, especially via the internet. Because on the internet, it's just radical. Either you're a radical this or you're a radical that. And let me tell you why these people are the bad guys. Let me tell you why this person is a fascist. Let me tell you why this person is a communist who wants to destroy your family values, and so on and so forth.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a kind of enclavism that gets going in response to this. There's a point in my book where I talk about, it's kind of like almost like CTE, where you just get hit really hard with the whiplash over and over of, you get behind somebody, they promise you vague things, they don't actually deliver on it, and there's a shock of coming to grips with that. And people can only take so many of those hard hits. Part of how the system functions is by always producing more young people who have not yet been hit in the head very many times. But people who are older get hit in the head over and over and over again when they try this sort of thing. And then there is this desire to just get away from it. In my first book, I talk about, kind of if there were balloonists who tried to give you advice, and every time you listen to the balloonists, you just end up in a situation that's just as bad, if not worse than before. Gradually over time, you come to hate those balloonists because they don't seem to experience what you experience. And the advice that they give you seems to be, maybe even designed to hurt you in some way, as if, they were just trying to mislead you. But those balloonists can often start off trying to help you in the story that I tell. Yeah. And initially, maybe they can do a little bit of good for you at the very beginning when they have not drifted off that high and they can still sort of see what's going on with some level of detail. But as they try to get further and further up to be able to talk to more and more people at once and help more and more people in a larger and larger way, it becomes harder and harder for them to see what's going on the ground and harder for them to hear from people on the ground about what's going on. And so they tend to lose their sense of what is occurring as they drift further and further up. And so people start trying to hide from these balloonists and avoid them and get away from them. And they retreat into my 4 Fs, which
I was going to
are
bring this
faith,
up. Yeah.
family, fandoms, and futurism.
So, okay, this is a good spot to bring this in because the first two of the 4 Fs, faith and family, somebody could say, okay, well, here's the problem with American democracy. We are degenerate. America's become decadent. We need a return to traditionalism. Traditionalism is this thing that can set us back on the right course. Whether it's the traditionalism of religion or whether it's the traditionalism of family. Benjamin, can faith and family solve the problem?
This to me, it's very much reminiscent of the conversation around localism. So a lot of people on the left like their commune, their like hippie commune thing. And the hippie commune thing is just family and faith, but from a left point of view.
Yeah.
Uh, in both cases, it's focus on what you can immediately affect, which seems to be in close proximity to you. The thing is, this system will degrade your ability to positively interact with what is close to you because it will strip you of the resources, not just money, but also time and energy that is required to be able to effectively interact with these things and have the kind of dynamic that you can sustain across time that's actually worth engaging in.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things I love are these movies about people who have midlife crises, and there are kind of levels to them. The kind of first level one is the one where, like 9 Lives with Kevin Spacey, where he goes, "Oh, I've been focusing on my career too much. I should care more about my family." Right? That's the basic midlife crisis Hollywood movie. The solution is just hug your kids, right? But then there's a level up from that where actually the family doesn't work either. The family has reached a point where it's degenerated to a point where it's a mess. And American Beauty is about this. There, Kevin Spacey, quits his job and tries to focus on his family. And nope, it doesn't work. Actually, he married the wrong people. His kids at this point, he's totally estranged from them. His attempt to focus on them doesn't actually produce any positive result. It's actually a real mess. And Lost in Translation is like this too. He tries to have a more authentic experience in his near periphery, but it's ephemeral, it's fleeting, it doesn't actually produce a form of life that can be sustained, right? The younger woman often shows up in a lot of this stuff to energize the man, give him some purpose. A lot of Murakami novels have this going, right? But the younger woman doesn't solve these problems either. It's just an attempt to restart the whole thing from a previous point. The best one I've ever seen is Icaroo, the Kurosawa movie from the 50s, because in Icaroo, he tries all of the things that happen in all the other midlife crisis movies, and each one of them fails. He tries just having a good time. He tries going to hang out with his son. He tries meeting a younger woman. He tries all of the things that people try in these movies. And most of the movies have come out after Icaroo because it came out in 52. None of them work. And so he's eventually, forced to come around to he should commit himself to trying to perform his role in the best possible way that he can. But then he dies. He's got stomach cancer in the movie. He dies. And then there's a meeting at his funeral of all of the other bureaucrats where they argue we should all try to be like him. And they have to realize that they can't be like him. because they're not dying, and therefore they have to live with the consequences of having done these things, which defy the incentives of the bureaucratic structure and would result in your career being ruined and you potentially, not having any money. And so even though they all admire what he did and think, of course, this is how we all should live, they can't actually follow any of it because they are stuck having to continue living in this system, and therefore they are actually affected by its incentives in a way that he wasn't, because he knew he was going to die of terminal cancer.
Okay, so Benjamin, is the solution to the chronic crisis of American democracy for us to only elect the terminally ill?
That's a fun idea. That's a fun idea.
I'm like, I'm kind of joking, but I'm kind of not. Like,
That's interesting. If somebody proposed that as a constitutional amendment, that would be interesting. You can only elect the terminally ill. I haven't heard that one before. I don't
well,
know. If you've noticed, there are some members of Congress who are terminally ill, like Ben Sass was terminally ill. And once he was terminally ill, he started talking very differently in the media from the way
because you
he
stop having to
previously
give a
talked.
fuck. It's like, no, like, you know what? I'm staring death in the face. I mean, it is kind of Heideggerian where it's like, no, I've kicked into this more authentic mode based on reckoning with my being towards death in an authentic way. And fuck the bullshit. Let's do something meaningful in the time. I mean, maybe there is something to that, you know?
Yeah, I think it also it genuinely deprives people. The possibility of dying soon genuinely deprives people of the consequences of what they're doing. And the reason that people, I think, would be hesitant to put the terminally ill in charge is that they will have to live with the consequences of what the terminally ill people do. And a lot of what we're talking about here is making disruptions to the economy, because you'd have to be willing to do things that make you unelectable, because you'd have to be willing to move on the basis of what the
But
nation
if we go
state
with
can do.
Icaroo, the consequences were good based on what
In
he
his
did.
case, he was able to achieve it before he died and before he was fired. So it had to be the kind of thing that could be done on that specific timescale. And
But
then the issue with our system is that the elections don't work on a timescale that is fully synced up with that.
yeah, but it's still worth thinking about, like,
Yeah.
if we could abstract this kind of time structure from Icaroo and apply it to the political level. There's something there to think through.
Yeah, there is something there. That's
I like that.
interesting.
Okay, so okay. So the let's since we've already talked about the first of the four F's, let's just talk about the next two. Fandom and futurism. To me, fandom is it's one way of talking about a kind of retreat into consumerism, and futurism is a kind of retreat into something akin to accelerationism. I have a soft spot for accelerationism, but your critique also very much resonates too. So, what's the issue with retreating into fandom and futurism?
Yeah, so fandoms and futurism, you could make a critique at the level of consumption, but I think the more profound critique is that it's corporatism. What
Mm,
makes the fan content? The entertainment corporation.
yeah.
What delivers the future? The tech corporation. So these become forms of corporatism. And of course, corporations are even less democratic than the nation state. They're even less democratic than, uh, you know, international political institutions. There's no democratic mechanism for influencing what corporations do. All you can do is stop buying the product or write negative reviews on the internet and hope that they convince other people to stop buying the product. Until people develop a continuing capacity to do large scale consumer boycotts, there isn't really going to be any sort of political mechanism for controlling what corporations do. And I do think that that's something that might develop in the future. We might get to a point where the consumer boycott becomes a more significant part of the landscape than it presently is, just as we used to live in a time where the producer boycott in the form of the strike was more influential than it is now. We might also get to a point where the consumer boycott becomes more important than it is now if there's
Mm,
development more in the direction of consumption and away from production over the course of time.
we
And
agree.
that could happen with technology automating production to a greater and greater degree, the importance of the human becomes the consumer choice, and the degree to which the economy relies on the human becomes much more at the level of the consumer activity than at the level of living labor.
I just want to say this is something that we both fully agree with you on, where, we're seeing it more and more, this move away from, look, I mean, and Marx was saying production is going to move towards automation, the replacement of human laborers with machines. But what machines are not going to do is have Netflix subscriptions and go to McDonald's and buy Nikes. This is not what machines do. And so it seems like our remaining functionality within the system is on the consumption side. And traditional Marxists who still want to emphasize production, this is where I don't see the future going that way. It's like it's like this idea that we're just still going to have a production based, you know, movement again that can actually combat the state and capital in any meaningful way. I think to invest in that right now, it's like it's over and done with on some level if we take AI and automation seriously. Nance?
Yeah.
I think that I think that's a misunderstanding of Marx and of value. Like I don't think Marx held to this hard labor theory of value. Marx understood that value comes from circulation itself. Like the value is in the circulation of exchange value itself. So it is this totally tautological thing. It posits itself, and it exists because it can continue to posit itself. So human labor is not the sole source of value. Like human labor under this context of exchange is the source of value. And so if we're replacing the human and we're still calling it labor, which it is objectified labor, machines are objectified labor, both physical human labor and intellectual labor, then of course it's going to shift from production to consumption because circulation is the key element. It's the churning. The system has to keep moving. And yeah, I think that's what Marx is saying. So I think all the Marxists just do the labor theory of value. Well, no, it's always going to be about production. And it's like, well, how? When no one is producing anything anymore, how is production going to have anything to do with it all?
Yeah, we end up having this argument because the labor force participation rate is still like 60%. And it's at that mid-level kind of range where there's a huge part of the population that isn't in the labor force, and it's not just old people and it's not just kids. There's a lot of people who can't really be regularly in the labor force. They can sometimes be irregularly in it, or they can be heavily underutilized within it, but they're not regularly in the labor force. And if you include underemployed people who are not using their full human skills, or even their full skills from the point of view of what used to be called human capital in their job, it's a huge part of the population that is underutilized from that point of view. But there's still 60% of the population in the labor force. So we're not yet to a point where people can really say, we can eclipse labor as the basis of, human labor as the basis of what we're doing. But we also are well past the point at which we can have a politics which is principally about human labor. Absolutely. At this point, when you try to kick that off, the jobs are going to move somewhere else where it's not kicked off. They're going to go somewhere else. And there's still lots of parts of the world that want very badly to develop into industrial states. There's still many countries that have not even yet been industrialized in any kind of heavy way and would badly like to manufacture a lot more stuff. So if we're expecting things to be transformed within a unit of time that's relevant to us on that basis, I don't see it. There's a possibility, though, that if we watch things for a longer period of time, we might move through a kind of middle space from a situation where one set of strategies and tactics look plausible to a situation where another set of strategies and tactics look plausible. But in that in-between space, it's a dead zone where nothing works and everything seems stupid.
So see, and this gets us to the whole thing. Well, the solution is class consciousness, working class politics, unionization, right? And on some level, would you just say too little, too late? Is that kind of
We passed the window where that looked like it could work. There was a period of time where it looked like that could work. I often call this kind of stuff now quixotic socialism. Like what Don Quixote is doing in that novel, where he's trying to be a knight, that used to make sense. The stuff he's doing, it used to actually form, be part of a social role that was important and that you couldn't really, it seemed like you couldn't really do without it in a particular form of society. Now he's romanticized it because he isn't living in that time where that role is widespread. He's just reading old medieval romance novels about, you know, how to be a knight. So his image of it is distorted because it's a fictionalized romantic image. But the problem with it is not just that it's a fictionalized romantic image. The problem with it also is that it's no longer appropriate to the time and place. Even if he was being a much more reasonable, normal kind of medieval knight, by the point in Spanish history that he's operating, there is just no call for that. And the story is not just about how he has a romantic notion of knighthood, it's also that even insofar as he acts like a real knight, it causes a lot of trouble and doesn't accomplish anything for anybody given the social conditions under which he lives. And that's what's going on here. We have both a romanticism of the socialism of 100 years ago that comes from reading about it rather than having been shaped by the conditions which generated it. And then also we have the fact that the conditions have really changed. So even if you could just get really serious and figure out how to be like Vladimir Lenin, actually be like him, it wouldn't have any of the same kinds of effects. It would now look totally different if you tried to live that way. What made Lenin and the socialists of the 19th century really great, interesting thinkers is that they looked at the situation they were in and developed strategies and tactics and ways of thinking that were appropriate to that situation, as opposed to pretending that they were from the 1700s and trying to do the strategies and tactics of people from the 1700s. But now, and they're celebrated for that, as for being modern, for not sticking to the past. But a lot of the people who celebrate them for being modern now enter into modernism as if it were a tradition and try to replicate or role play in the way that Don Quixote tries to role play being a knight.
okay? So, what about somebody who says, okay, well, the problem with American democracy is it doesn't exist in the image and likeness of those wonderful Scandinavian social democracies that have the highest happiness rates in the world. Why can we not fix America simply by making America Scandinavian?
So the European countries are all gradually grinding away at their post war models. They're all gradually stripping these models down. But it doesn't happen all at once, it happens gradually over a long period of time. Norway's got a bunch of oil, so it has and a huge sovereign wealth fund that's based on its oil being very large relative to its population. So Norway may be able to persist for much longer than many of these other countries in this model because it's a petrol state. But broadly across the board, if you look at what's actually going on in the domestic politics of the European countries, and Americans hate doing this, they hate really, really looking at contemporary European politics and following it in a detailed way. All of these models are gradually getting ground down by the competitive pressure, slowly but surely, a little bit at a time. And it comes under names like flexible labor markets. The Germans, with their Hartz reforms from the 2000s, made it much easier to fire people than it was before. They've only just recently in German factories banned drinking on the job. There's a gradual grinding down of these things, a little bit at a time, of these hard won rights. One of the things that slows it down is proportional representation. And people go, oh, if we got proportional representation, then we'd be more like European countries. They don't understand what proportional representation does. It makes it so that you have to have a coalition to be able to do anything, which makes it harder to change anything. That's what PR does. PR retards change. So when you install PR, in a post-World War II context where you've got a social democratic government that's installed, and that social democratic government is part of the US alliance structure, what PR does is it makes it really difficult for a communist party to win and then radically change a lot of stuff. Because even if the communists get a large number of seats, they'll have to go into a coalition. And this makes it really, really difficult for a far left government to make wild, wacky changes. It also works the same way for the right. The right has the same experience in European politics of it wins elections, but only on condition it go into a coalition with some other party. And what often happens is that there's a grand coalition to keep out the right. So even when the right wins a plurality, it doesn't get in. Or the right is brought into the government, but then it's within the framework of a coalition that totally stymies what it can do. And if you go into European right-wing arguments, the European right is constantly angry and frustrated about all of this. Yes, PR allows you to get seats, and if you don't have any seats, it therefore looks very attractive, but then it never actually allows you to govern the country. You are always having to go into coalition with centrists to be able to do anything. And because in PR you can just vote for whatever the party is, for whatever party you want, you can vote based on your ethical feelings without really thinking about how the government's going to work, because that's going to be the outcome of a coalition agreement. So people in European politics will often start parties that are focused on just winning tiny, tiny bands of the vote, but reliable bands of the vote that will get them always into the parliament, always over the threshold for getting in. Dutch politics, the threshold is really low. So if you have a party that just caters really heavily to a particular special interest, you can guarantee that you get into parliament because the people in that special interest group will always be best served by you. So there's a party for people over the age of 50 in the Netherlands that just defends the pension system no matter what happens, because that's their voter base. And as long as they do that, they will always be in parliament, and they never have to worry about losing an election ever again. Part of what makes democracy work is the possibility of losing an election, and PR makes it really, really difficult to actually lose your seat. You have to really get waxed in PR to actually get kicked out. So it allows people to constantly glaze their supporters about how morally good and wonderful they are while accomplishing nothing, and always saying at the next election, maybe we'll get a few more percentage points. And then that never really happens. In a lot of these countries, election after election after election, you get broadly the same result. And sometimes in PR, you get a governability crisis where you can't actually make a stable coalition. And it's in those situations where you get a real possibility of authoritarianism, because if you don't have a government for a long period of time, that's when people say, democracy just doesn't work. Well, it's not that democracy doesn't work, it's that PR doesn't work. For a country that's that divided, PR starts to break down and become dysfunctional. That's why the British have first past the post. The British created that system on the premise that the commoners would always be a problem for the aristocracy, and they would need to be managed by something that's able to get a large plurality, but doesn't need to get a majority, and which can then win without having to go into coalition with the workers. But of course, the Labor Party eventually figured out how to win within that system.
So this, you mentioned something that I wanted to bring up. So can authoritarianism fix the problem? So what I mean by this, though, in particular, the neo-reactionary movement, which, I think Nick Land thinks NRX is kind of over. It had its moment. But at its height, him and Curtis Yarvin, thinking about, their critiques of democracy. And for them, it's like, if we were to talk about the chronic crisis of American democracy, they would say, hold on, we got to take a step back. It's just the crisis of democracy itself. The problem is democracy. And what we need is to just let the state entirely merge with capital. So you have this whole theory of SovCorps or sovereign corporations, or the patchwork, where you basically have a corporation that owns and operates Missouri, and people live there and work there, blah, blah, blah. And so, and each SovCorp would be governed by a capitalist monarch. And so there would be like this fundamental corporate authority, and yet this authority is geared entirely towards the profit motive and competition. So, with democracy basically out of the way, it can't gum up the works or suspend the animation of capital. And capital is, especially for Nick, the AI problem solver. So, you know, what do you think of this type of NRX authoritarianism as the solution to democracy is to get rid of it?
Well, they don't think that capital mobility is the unsolvable problem. They think it's the infinite solution.
That's yes. Like if you wrote something, that's the title. Like that's it right there.
Yeah. If you think it's the infinite solution, then you'd have a very different attitude. But what I would say is if you look at how people are behaving, there does seem to be a legitimacy crisis in these democracies. And it's not because they've become more capable of restraining capital mobility over time and people are frustrated with the restraints that they're able to impose. You could make an argument that perhaps that was the case for a certain part of the population in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, or at least some people in the population interpreted what was going on in that kind of way. But now the complaint tends to be along the lines of stuff like in-shitification, that public services don't, nothing works anymore, that you have to work really, really hard and you can't buy basic things that you previously were able to buy. The causes of these problems seem to be rooted, I would say, in the capital mobility. Now, the idea of having a corporation that runs a state like Kansas, right? You still have territorial units that are in competition with each other, so their behavior will be shaped by the competition. If the problem is what the competition forces everybody to do, that the competition makes us all do whatever is profitable or makes us do in a previous era whatever allows you to win militarily, and those are the two forms of competition that have played the largest role in structuring us, over the course of human history. Uh, the only way that you can qualify that is to have something which is able to cut across those territorial distinctions and make decisions that apply across territory.
So I
Right
mean,
now,
look,
we don't have a way of thinking about democracy that's compatible with that.
so I remember Slavoj talking about Yarvin and saying how, like, actually, this whole idea of his isn't really new. We've done it before, like the East Indies Trading Company, and he talked about how brutally oppressive this was to the people, and like it's just absolute, you know, it's really slavery. Now, of course, Yarvin and Land wouldn't want it, the Sovcorp framed in that way. But there's this problem of, well, if people want to leave, where do they go? And they're like, well, of course you have you have, uh, free exit, no voice. So you're free to leave, but you don't get a say in anything here if you stay. And the thing is, well, what if the other Sovcorps don't want the people who want to leave? Where do they go? And so, I mean, it just gets into this whole problem of it really, at the end of the day, aren't we talking about a kind of social structure that simply instrumentalizes people?
We have this to a significant degree already in the United States. There's a population that nobody wants to live in their town and that nobody wants to employ. People want these people to be stable, right? The rich people want these people to behave, but they don't want to employ them because it's not productive to employ them. So it doesn't make sense to employ them. But also, if you start just giving people who don't have jobs stuff without them having to work, then this debilitates the incentive to get the people you do want to work to work. So we have this large population that nobody wants. And for a while, we used to institutionalize these people. We used to have facilities that were funded by the state out of taxation that could be used to house the people that nobody wanted to employ. Now, nobody wants to pay the tax revenue that is necessary for that. And because capital mobility has increased, nobody has to pay. Everyone can say, well, if you're going to tax me that much, I'm going to take off. And then these people are moving around the world, migrating from place to place. And within the United States or within a European country, it often gets talked about at the level of homelessness. But globally, you can talk about it at the level of migration. a huge, ever increasing part of the global population that nobody really wants to employ, certainly not at a wage that would provide for any level of stability, and which consequently moves around the world, with states then asked to deal with this without raising taxes.
Yeah. Okay. Well, what if the solution is just a good old fashioned socialist slash communist party? Is the solution to build socialism and communism in America? Could that work?
I think if you're still stuck within one state, even if it's a very large state, you have the Stalinism problem, which is that you are going to have your revolution barbarized by the competition conditions that you failed to abolish. If you remain stuck in a single territory, what that means is that you've not been able to overcome the competition with other territorial entities. And therefore, that competition will continue to shape your project in ways that you don't even intend for, in ways that you might actively regard as a problem. In Lenin's later writings, he talks all about how it's a terrible problem that the Soviet Union is contained to the former territory of the Russian Empire, and the failure of this thing to spread and to appear in other territory will completely shape the project to the point at which it can't be meaningfully socialist. It will be entirely shaped by that fact. And even now people, when they talk about civilizations, a plurality of civilizations, what are they doing? They're in competition with each other, commercial competition, security competition, and it's those forms of competition that determine the way that they behave, not some essential transhistorical cultural content that's somehow pure and can shoot through all of that. The only way that any way of doing anything survives competition is to be compatible with it.
Okay. What about the idea that, you know, us dum dums like Nance and I should just shut up and listen to the PMC, the managerialism, that if the stubborn, obscene working class would shut up and take orders from the polished, refined intellectuals and managerial types, that would lead to the solution.
I think what people who are not university educated have observed over the years is that when they vote for these liberal types who say, don't worry about all the campus stuff, don't pay attention to that. We're going to give you economic benefits at the end of the day that are going to make it worth it to put up with all of that the economic benefits never ultimately materialize for them. There's a point Plato makes when he's talking about Athens, about how there's this class of idlers, the sophists, who are educated. They go to rhetoric school and they do all the talking in the Athenian democracy. And they take a lot of money from the oligarchs, but they never give any of it to the large mass of Athenians who don't go to rhetoric school. They just constantly try to use rhetoric to deceive these people into supporting them in the assembly. And I talk about that also in the first book. There's a bit where we talk about this problem of just listen to the experts. And this often comes up in deliberative democracy discussions where people say, well, what you need is a better deliberation, an informed deliberation. You create like a citizens jury, and you make all of the people who participate in the jury look at some information so that they're informed for their discussion. But, then the question is, well, who decides what counts as information? There's some other deliberation that occurs before this one that sets this one up on the basis of what the experts who have the university degrees have decided is the appropriate way to set it up. And they try to machine the ordinary people into affirming what they already think that they ought to affirm. A lot of ancient Republican structures work like this, where you have a people's assembly, but the people's assembly has to be shaped beforehand by deliberations that occur outside of it, that are used to get all of the people in the assembly to validate whatever it is that they always already want to do. And an argument can be made that, well, it does impose some constraint that you have to put it in such a way that they can be made to validate it. And it does. But historically, all kinds of stuff, which ultimately doesn't serve those people, gets through those assemblies. And then what tends to happen is those people become aware of the fact that the assemblies don't empower them to win, is that they start looking for a protector figure to save them from the rhetoricians and talkers who constantly deceive and befuddle them. And then this leads you into the Caesarism.
Okay, then what about, well, the solution isn't to get workers to shut up and identify with the PMC. We need a universalization of the PMC itself. All citizens, if they were better educated, had a liberal education, this would ultimately solve the problem of democracy. So, a liberally educated citizenry is what we need.
Yes, we tried this. Everybody's got to go to college. If everybody goes to college, then everybody will get a good job. Yeah, that's the ideology of the 70s and 80s. Comes out of the new left, and it becomes, okay, you can't rely on the workers to make the revolution. They're a labor aristocracy. Their trade unions are all embedded into the thing. It's got to be the students, the young people, the educated people, the people who can see that there's a problem, right? So everybody has to go to the university. One of the things that happens is the university becomes worse when you rush to send everybody to it without creating conditions in society where everybody actually does have the skills and capabilities. So then they become obsessed with trying to generate these in the secondary schools. College readiness becomes the obsession, and they try that for a while. But what ultimately happens is that while they're able to increase the percentage significantly, and it dramatically change society, the attempt to send everybody to college, they can't actually get everybody there. First, the act of trying to get everybody there causes lots of people to come through who don't actually have real meaningful skills because they've been pushed through and given good grades, even though they aren't able. And secondly, you can't absorb all of these people in the kinds of roles that they would need to be in to maintain the socialization that you want them to have. So when people aren't able ultimately to get into the prestige roles, they then develop various kinds of coping techniques and mechanisms for dealing with the fact that they've been shut out of the prestige roles. And some of these involve deliberately trying to set themselves above the people who didn't go to college. And if not deliberately, then sometimes even on just a subconscious level, wanting all the time to emphasize that they got something out of the college experience, which is the right think, the right values, the truth, real information, knowledge, and fetishizing all of these things and turning them into a kind of dogma. So it degrades what the university education is when it turns into this kind of dogma to protect people who have been economically unsuccessful from having to confront that. And so it has heavily epistemic degrading tendencies on the people in that situation over time. And then also, there's an invitation for the people who have been successful to use the willingness of the fallen professionals to believe that they're more knowledgeable than other people to say, you are a really smart, educated person. So you understand that we have to run the society in this particular kind of way for it to be acceptable, or for it to be competitive, or it to be able to get by. And because people want to identify with the successful people and think of themselves as with the successful people, this happens. It used to get talked about all the time in terms of workers wanting to be small business people or workers wanting to be petty bourgeois. If you want to get your own truck, you want to go out on your own, start your own plumbing business, right? But the same thing happens at the level of the university educated people, because they have the same problem. You have a large percentage, which is more than can actually be in the prestige roles. And then this extra part of the population becomes badly degenerated by that fact. And part of this is kind of, stuff you could even describe as lumpen, insofar as it involves begging for money. A lot of what university educated people start doing is begging other people for money because they're not able to find some form of stable employment that would allow them to think more like members of the proletariat. And this, academics do this all the time at the level of, applying for grants. And when you're applying for grants, when you're begging or writing applications for jobs continuously because you never have any stability, you are constantly thinking about how you appear to somebody else. And you have this image of you might get this thing in the future, but only if you appear a certain way to someone else. So the way that you behave is continuously disciplined with reference to the successful professional that you're trying to impress so that you can join that person and become one of those people.
That's great.
I think that accounts for bread tube. or I don't think they call it bread tube anymore. But yeah, I think a lot of a lot of the people who are presenting themselves as uh, non-traditional educators or whatever by way of non-traditional means, such as the internet. I think they are this kind of lumpenized, uh, fallen professional class, and I think that's funny.
Yeah, people talk about it in terms of audience capture a lot.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I mean, Benjamin, we've talked about the problems with reformism, but then you could have somebody go, okay, but let's get more concrete. Like if we did campaign finance reform, or if we got rid of the electoral college, or we really truly tax the rich again, these are different strategies in reformism that could really solve the problem. I mean,
Yeah, what you
campaign
can do with
finance,
this
yeah,
is you could point to, for every one of these things, the reason people think it can be done is that someone else has done it, right? When people say, oh, you should change the electoral law, you should change the campaign finance law, you'll go, well, come on, can that be done? And they'll go, yes, it can be done. There's another country that has done it, right? But then if you go, okay, has that other country been able to prevent its economic inequality from increasing over the last 30 years? Has that other country been able to get more control over the way how capital operates within its borders? A lot of the stuff that people will point to, actually, after it was introduced in other countries, the economic conditions deteriorated in those other countries relative to the situation before that policy was brought into force. What that implies is that the background structural conditions are much, much, much more powerful than those policies.
and what's the response to that? Nuh-uh. Like, yeah. So I mean,
There's a bit where I talk about in the first book, Luke Savage has written a number of pieces for Jacobin over the years where he'll point to other countries where other things are being done. But he's also written a lot of pieces where he'll say, if we did those things, it wouldn't be enough.
Mm.
And then when a result happens that he doesn't like, he'll assign blame for that result to the fact that we haven't done the things that he
We didn't
says
do
wouldn't be enough anyway. And I don't mean to pick on Luke Savage. He's just one particular person who happens to have written all of these different pieces under his own name. But the left in general as a whole continuously plays this, I call it the hope industry game of only emphasizing certain parts of this at any given time, depending on what generates in the audience the attitude that the person wants. And I'm not saying that these people are necessarily deliberately lying. It's just if you are continuously in the habit of providing content for these kinds of outlets, you are always thinking in terms of what are these kinds of outlets going to be willing to pay for. There's a lumpen aspect, which degenerates your ability to think clearly about this stuff on its own terms. You're instead thinking about this writing in terms of who will publish this. Oh, they'll want something like this. They'll take this. And very rarely do you actually sit there and go, wait a minute, do all of my pieces fit together? What happens if you combine them?
yeah. I mean, look, for a long time, I say, I know you have your disagreements with Žižek, but I've always said that where you and him are closest is where he said, he talks about the courage of hopelessness. Like, no, you really do have to face the hopelessness of the situation if you're going to have any way of orienting yourself towards it in a way that could actually lead somewhere better. And so, like, hopelessness, being courageous enough to stand in the shutness of the way is maybe the only way forward.
Yeah, in the new book, in the second book, I talk at the end about the four moods, that people can be in at different points in their life: the conservative mood, the liberal mood, the negative mood, and the enclavist mood. So the conservative mood is the mood of accepting and embracing the legitimation stories that have been told historically and saying, why do we need new stories? Shouldn't we just judge everything in terms of these older stories that have been around for a long time and have served us well? And the liberal mood is to say, no, those stories aren't good enough anymore. This situation is too dissatisfying for that. But what we need is to update our understanding of the key liberal abstractions. We need to understand equality in a new way, freedom in a new way, representation needs to mean something else. And one of the arguments I make is that the university system tends to produce the liberal mood. Part of the function of the university system is to cultivate that liberal mood in people who go through it, right? There's another possibility, which is to say, no, you can futz around with those terms all you want. It doesn't actually produce conditions under which a change can occur. There's a bit in negative dialectics where Adorno says, you can question, challenge reification discursively. It's not the same thing as getting rid of the conditions that give rise to the concepts. So you could say, we should talk about these things in different terms, but that doesn't give you an actual capacity to change anything. The university discourse is premised on there being this revolutionary, student who then goes out into the world and has an actual capacity to change it on the basis of being introduced to these new ways of thinking. There's no reason to think that actually exists in our current time and place. So it doesn't actually have any functionality to it. So once you get to the stage of going, wait a minute, you can't actually do anything with the liberal mood. Some people go back to the conservative mood. Some people move to the enclavist mood and say, I'm not going to look at politics to try to get my fundamental values met. I'm going to go into the 4Fs. The argument that I make is that what we need to do is to be able to sit in the negative mood where we are not persuaded by any of the legitimation stories that are currently thrown out to get us to go along with stuff, including the story that we can just do something in our private life or by patronizing various corporations or doing certain kinds of work for corporations. And when I say corporations, I include not just the state bureaucracy, the TNCs, the NGOs, all of these kinds of corporate entities that offer you meaning in terms of the future that they generate if you commit your life to serving them. If we can get outside of that stuff and sit in this negative mood, then we might be able to gradually over time, if we observe things from within this negative mood, start to see something else that can happen or that can take place. But it requires being able to stay in the negative mood. And I think one of the problems we have is that on a metaphysical level, on a philosophical level, people lack the resources necessary to stay in the negative mood. They lack the conceptual resources. And they lack the conceptual resources in part because there is nothing that can constitute people such that they can withstand the negative mood. The university generates the liberal mood. There is no institution for the negative mood to defend it or to kind of curate it at all and prevent it from slipping into its very pernicious bad varieties. So negative despair, the kind of despair that's the negative, the bad version of the negative, is the suicidality, the horrible lifestyle that will kill you. It's the terrorism. It's the just wanton criminality.
Nihilism.
It's the stuff people, the nihilism, the ironism, the very, very ironic, unserious, pretending to have an attitude or a politics that you don't actually have, which is one step away from having it, but also is very different because it's a sense of humor to cover up a total impotence. All of these things are in that negative mood. And if we had some kind of institutional structure that could help us to be in the negative mood, but in a positive way, then I think we could start to actually gradually over time have the kind of discussion that would be generative and serious and rigorous, as opposed to just playing around and trying to cope with these various conditions.
In a sense, wouldn't it be philosophy in an institutionalized form? Like if there was a way to make philosophy itself an institution, that's what it would be.
Yeah, that's why I get into a lot of those Neoplatonic ideas about the philosophical school, or I look at some of the early monastics who were influenced by these ideas of trying to realize or institutionalize philosophy. There's a book I just ordered that's a cool, interesting book by a guy, Christoph Scheringa, called Karl Marx and the Actualization of Philosophy. I'm plugging somebody else's book now.
I like it.
But it's a really interesting book because he makes the case that what Marx is trying to do is to actually bring philosophy into being and make it concrete. So, that would involve actually creating the institutions that allow for philosophy to take place. The university pretends that it's that, but it's never really been able to play that role. It's always kind of exaggerated its capacity there. And as it has tried to expand very quickly, the cost of its expansion is superficiality. It's only able to spread really fast if it dumbs itself down and thins itself out. And so now we have a version of the university that's very discredited because it's so flimsy. And not only is it discrediting the university as a form, because intellectual activity and philosophical activity is bound up with the university in the public imaginarium, it discredits thinking and reasoning and creates a situation where people can accept artificial intelligence as doing that better than people can do it anyway.
It's awesome. I mean, Benjamin, this has been great. I don't want to cut it off quite yet. I kind of just want to take a little bit of time in the time we have left to kind of just open it up more to a free form discussion. Because, I mean, Nance, like everything that we've been discussing, there's so much to draw from. But like recently, Benjamin, Nance and I did a little video. You know, basically, it's more of a rant than anything, but it was us expressing basically just how we feel about not being able to have access to healthcare in a robust sense, right? And the little image I like is that, and I know I say this, I'm speaking from almost like a childlike naive to but I'm fine with that. I'll affirm it, which is just like healthcare should be like a public drinking fountain. Like it should just be whatever it is, like that's it. Like nobody monitors who goes up and uses a drinking fountain now. You can have as much as you want. You don't have to drink it if you don't need it. Like, and there was some pushback where it's like this wasn't researched enough, or the only way you could ever have this kind of healthcare is if you had a revolution and we were in a totally different mode of production. We were in communism and all this kind of stuff. And so,
or the libertarian who said, I would only support that if we had dietary restrictions.
Right.
And by the way, I'm a libertarian.
Right. So, but my question to you is, there's such a desire circulating in America. I mean, you see it in comment sections where, some celebrity will post something about politics and going off, and then just in the comments, you'll see somebody going, can I just have healthcare? I mean, what do you think? Like, are these types of issues things that we should really here and now be demanding and fighting for, or is the way shut even to them? Like, is there any way we could improve things at all right now?
So I think that there is still some scope for stuff that makes life a little bit easier so that people have a little bit more space to think and their life isn't so heavily shaped by immediate competitive imperatives. In just the last couple of decades, there are things that have moved in such a way that people are exposed much more directly to much more severe competitive pressure than they were just a couple decades ago. How much of that is completely unavoidable and just based on rising capital mobility? And how much of that is based on fatalism on the part of people and an inability even to put up even mild resistance? It's still the case that in the UK, there's a national health service that's free at the point of use. The health service is gradually getting defunded. It's gradually running out of money. As it runs out of money, the wait times keep increasing. And then the only way that they can avoid the wait times increasing is to privatize more and more parts of it. So it's gradually getting killed, but it's not gone yet. It still exists. And right now, one of the things that happens all the time in UK politics is that a party will say, if you vote for us, we'll find more money for this NHS thing. And a lot of people get elected to office in the UK by talking about this because people don't want this thing to go away. They know the difference that it makes to have it. Ultimately, for the UK to be able to have an NHS that's functional, it needs a greater capacity to tax than it currently has. It needs more economic activity than it would have if it raised taxes in a vacuum. Outside of the European Union and outside of any kind of tax cartel, the UK is really going to struggle to raise the revenue that it needs to keep that health service going. So there's now this acute pressure on the UK to Americanize its economy to boost the growth rate because there doesn't seem to be any other way to generate a level of growth that would keep a sustainable tax base going. And if you argue in the UK for higher taxes, people go, well, the UK already has crazy high taxes relative to its immediate competitors. And its immediate competitors don't have the bureaucratic nonsense that they have to deal with as a country outside the European Union. So I think that there's still some scope, especially in Europe, for organizing on some of these issues where you have public services that still exist, that have not yet disappeared. And there's also, I think, some scope in the United States for trying to get these public services in some form or fashion before the window completely shuts on the possibility of even obtaining them. And some people would say, oh, the window is already shut on obtaining them. You missed the opportunity in the 60s. That's when you could have done it. But one of the things that I think we could also talk about here is the future of the transatlantic thing and the relationship between Europe and the United States. One of the things that's gone wrong is that the European mode of life and the American mode of life seem to have, to some degree, become opposed, to the point where on the internet, people talk all the time about Europe and America as if they're different civilizations. And I see this talk, like even in Žižek, he increasingly talks about America like it's a decrepit, alternative Western civilization.
Mhm.
This is something that if this is how it goes, if Europeanism is defended against Americanism, I think it's going to be really difficult ultimately to sustain the European structures, because so much of those are bound up with the cooperation with the United States. And conversely, if Americanism becomes opposed to Europeanism, then it will be very difficult in the United States to try to organize for any of these things that are common in European countries. So one of the things that we have to, I think, try to overcome, and I think there's still some scope for trying to do this by talking about these basic issues that affect everybody on both sides of the Atlantic Ocean, and which are really heavily impeded by the fact that we don't have common tax regulatory policies. Healthcare is the principal big issue. We're also seeing a degradation of the university system in a lot of these countries because the university system is increasingly broke. We're seeing a degradation in infrastructure and a housing crisis in a lot of these countries. There's a suite of, maybe 4 different issues, maybe 5 issues. One of the major problems is that energy has become an issue that the United States and Europe are on different sides of, because the United States has become an oil and gas exporter, and Europe has become dependent on American liquefied natural gas and unable to develop a strategy for energy independence on a relevant timeline. And this has become a big problem. And a lot of the green politics in Europe is now interfacing with the energy politics in a way that makes it really difficult for Europe to have an independent energy policy. And this is something that I think is also a major concern, because if the Europeans are made dependent on the Americans for liquefied natural gas, but European civilization becomes opposed to American civilization, then this produces a dynamic in which the Europeans will not actually be able to, in an economically viable way, break from the United States. They'll be desiring to break from the United States. They won't actually be able to do that. And so the attempt to do this alternative European project will just ultimately accelerate the Americanization, because as they confront their inability to go some other way, it will just increase the seeming naturalness of complying with the American competitive dynamic. And that's where I think a lot of this is going, like a lot of the, increase European military budgets so that they're not dependent on the US for security. What does that do concretely? It means that European countries have a defense spending percentage that looks more like the American, which means their budgets look more like the American budget, which means the physical constraints that they're going to face in other areas are going to be more like those which the Americans experience. And they're going to be doing this with the euro. They're going to be doing it from an inferior position with regard to control over monetary policy. So, right now, the European Union has brought back the old fiscal rules, but just with an exemption for military spending. So if you want to do any stimulus, you can't be healthcare, it can't be education, it can only be military spending or stuff that you can rationalize as military spending. This is going to dramatically Americanize European society over time. And it's being justified on the basis of opposition to the United States, which is the really sick thing about it. It's using the latent remaining European energy to oppose the commercial logic, to get people to acquiesce to and support the final stripping down and degradation of these structures. So this is something that I think there's still space to talk about this and draw attention to it and try to get some level of international discussion going about how do we sustain the European social programs. You know, a lot of Americans admire Germany, admire Japan, admire life in different countries. There, I think, needs to be a much greater understanding that these allied states were only able to build these models because they were protected from security competition by the United States. And the United States, conversely, has been unable to bring in those same kinds of programs because it has kept itself under these competitive pressures by continuing to regard all of these other states as competitors and to treat them as competitors. The United States constantly throws enormous amounts of money at playing these competitive games instead of building the public services that would give the population some ability to think outside of the limitations of that framework. So that's where I would want to put the focus, because if we can, there's been a tremendous barbarization of the European conversation since the Euro crisis, just because the public services have deteriorated and people feel less stable. The whole conversation has become worse, and people's ability to think has diminished. And so this is where I think there's still something. Can we protect and maybe even rebuild a little bit the capacity of people to think and have a constructive discussion about what to do? And that isn't necessarily to prefigure a specific outcome of that discussion, but to posit what are the prerequisites for a discussion that would be good. And not just at the level of oh, you could have an informed deliberation, but at the actual material level of what does the society have to look like?
Mm.
You know, what kinds of structures need to be in place so that people are safe enough and secure enough? Because right now, you know, you can't even think about, you know, quitting your job in the United States if you have a health problem.
No.
Yep.
No.
You know, you can't even think about it. You know, your ability to, you know, organize at work in a way that might get you fired is extremely restrained, you know, by that.
Yeah. Exactly. Okay, so Benjamin, I have one last thing I want to ask you about before we do that. Nance, with everything that we've been talking about lately, you know, we've been all over the place with what we've been thinking about. Is there anything you want to get Benjamin's take on?
I mean, I just first, um, this political analysis and talking about like the Americanization of Europe and all this. Like it, for me, I think, Mikey, you and I spend a lot of time doing fault line. We spend a lot of time doing social theory, critical theory, and analysis, and talking about like the objectification, like the dangers, especially me. I spend so much time focused on the dangers of AI, not because, oh, I'm Bernie and AI's taking all your jobs, but because like what we're writing about, the superego of it all, like how it's this artificial intelligence and capital. It's not big sensational YouTube videos. They took our jobs, but there's this subtle, insidious process of objectification where capital, by way of artificial intelligence, it's the superegoic machine that's actualizing itself, and it's actually eating up the surface of the planet. And we have to use ridiculous language, but it really is like a war against or a war between the human subject and the object that is AI, that is capital, that is superegoic. But I know for me particularly that like there's just a dearth of political analysis, and what you do, I think, really does demonstrate capital is this global machine that it's eating into our shared humanity, our shared subjectivity. Like it's making it harder and harder for us to think. It's making it more and more difficult for us to live meaningful or even pleasant lives. It's just like immiseration is rising across the board. And I appreciate that. I think it's really important to be able to come and analyze, you know, the moment that we live in, history or whatever, from different angles. And I think for my part anyway, I do think that's ultimately what you're doing is saying, hey, people, wake up. There's this thing called capital, and it's killing you and the planet. Just to really kind of dumb it down, least common denominator type language. And I like that.
Well, the way is shut because the escape of capital. Like,
exactly. Yeah. Like it really is. I really do think there's an accelerationist analysis going on with the chronic crisis and legitimacy. But it's probably for a lot of people, they wouldn't recognize it as like this analysis of acceleration. But that's
you
what
can
I
find
see.
it like explicitly in the article that I wrote with Dirk Yerka in the European Journal of Social Theory called Debilitated Democracy. There we explicitly talk about Hartmut Rosa, social acceleration, and put this in terms of accelerating modernization.
Yeah.
You know,
I mean, that's exactly
democracy
what
is
land is
created
about.
by a certain level of modernization, but is then foreclosed by modernization accelerated beyond a certain point. And since modernization has a tendency to accelerate, it therefore has a tendency to produce conditions which overcome the democracy that it creates. So modernity is both associated with democracy, and then it becomes its great destroyer.
Yeah. I mean, and that's the logic of capital. Like capital, it's this thing, again, it's the self-positing thing that then destroys itself, or at least revolutionizes itself in its environment to reposit itself and do it all over once again. And so to be able to say, hey, our democracy, yes, thank you, modernity. I don't want to be a pre-modern and retreat into the first two of the F's. But it is also true that our democracy is being eroded by the very conditions that and I think modernity is this moment where hey, we're finally free. Let's take up this challenge of like I think modernity is a challenge, and we failed to take it up over and over and over again because capital, is the shiny object, and it's pay no attention to the man behind the curtain. So,
and it gets harder. The faster it goes and the more mobile it becomes, the harder it is to actually get on top of it. The more sophisticated the political structures need to be. And the level of sophistication makes it difficult for those structures that could actually get a hold of it to appear meaningfully democratic.
yeah.
But so far, we don't have any new way of thinking about politics. Yeah, and most of the time when people do try to propose something non-democratic or beyond democratic or post-democratic, it's just antique, corporatist authoritarianism.
Benjamin, one of the reasons I'm happiest about talking to you again is for real. Like I like, to me, like one of the biggest compliments I can give you is this. By and large, whenever a political analyst starts talking about geopolitics, I'm just like, yeah, whatever, I don't care. Because most of the time, it doesn't come from a position of like genuine interrogative analysis. There are very few people whose opinion on geopolitics matter to me, and you're one of them. And so, look, one of the things I just want to ask you about, I mean, obviously, it is relevant because he's, the president of our democracy right now. But I just wanted to get your take. Are you surprised with how Trump's been lately with, okay, he does the Iran thing. Gas prices have gone up and stayed up, and there's speculation it'll get worse. When asked about, do you care about what you're doing with Iran and the Strait of Hormuz affects the finances of Americans, he says, no, I don't even think about it at all. I mean, I've never seen the Trump supporters that I know in my life more mad at Trump than they are now. What do you make of what's been happening in the last few months?
Yeah, so there was just recently a story that said that the goal apparently was to install Mahmoud Ahmadinejad initially. And they thought that they accidentally killed Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, but they didn't kill Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. They just failed, however, to produce conditions under which he would be installed. they were able to change the regime in the sense that the kind of regime that you have now in Iran is not like the one that you had before. The theologians were pushed into picking a dynastic heir by the military. So now you have something that's much more of a military junta and looks much more like a monarchy, which is one of the things that the Iranian Revolution was staged in opposition to. The idea that you pick the Ayatollah's, the supreme leader's son as supreme leader completely contravenes the anti-monarchism of the Iranian, revolution and of the republic as a form. So there has been, I think, a major change to the form of the regime. It's much more militarized now, but they did not get the people in charge that they were looking to get in charge. They wanted somebody they could work with who would have some level of bona fides with the hardliners. The idea with Mahmoud Ahmadinejad is that they could work with him, but also he was someone who could carry some amount of hardline support. They didn't come anywhere close to getting him in charge. And now the people that they've got in charge are at odds with each other because you've got the Republican government is bothered. The civil people are ticked off that the military has been empowered, that the theologians ultimately succumb to the pressure from the military to pick their candidate. Because prior to this, the civil people within Iran, their hope was that the interim council could stay in power for a prolonged period of time because the president is part of the interim council. So if the interim council is in charge, then the highest civil leader, who's the president of Iran, would have some of the powers of the supreme leader, which would increase the powers of the president. So this would also be a significant change in the regime that would be in the direction of empowering the Republican parts of the Iranian system. The president of Iran then tried to apologize to the Gulf states for striking them. I don't know if you remember this story, but it was relatively early that he tried to do this. And in response to that, the theologians flipped from being willing to entertain the interim council idea to support for the military candidate, who is the son. And once that happened, then you got these reports that the Trump administration was talking to other people in Iran, and the other people were the Speaker of the legislature. They were members of the Republican apparatus that were alienated by the choice of the son and concerned about what that meant for their role in the future of Iranian politics. So then you got these negotiations, and in the negotiations, the diplomats who are talking to the Trump administration are offering things that the military leaders ultimately won't accept. So you get these reports of Iran might be willing to give on the nuclear material. They might be willing to do some number of years of moratorium on enrichment. They might be willing to move uranium out of the country. And then this stuff doesn't ultimately go through. You don't get an agreement on these terms, or you find out that the terms would also include other stuff which is not acceptable to other states, like tolls on ships going through the strait. And that's something that's not just unacceptable to the United States. That's something that China, lots of other states, they don't want to pay the added cost of that. And that's a problem for all of them as well. So this has gotten into, it's become a difficult situation because now the government isn't totally functional. The people that the administration is talking to and the people who actually have the power to make the decisions are not necessarily aligned. The administration has looked to split them in various ways at previous points in the conflict, which has increased mistrust among them and made it harder for them to negotiate effectively as a team. So it seems really difficult to get a deal because, and what the administration is likely to think is that as they continue to not get a deal, maybe the government in Iran is stalling for time and trying to kick things along. And this is why they brought in the blockade. The blockade is supposed to increase the cost of the negotiations for the Iranians by having a continuous bleeding effect on the Iranian economy. And some estimates put it at something like 1% of GDP every week, which of course it wouldn't, even if that is the number, it won't hold at that number forever because Iran will establish different supply chains to mitigate that, even if that is the initial number in the first week. But this is now become a kind of waiting game where you have the Americans waiting for the blockade to force the Iranians to make a deal they previously wouldn't have made. And the Iranians are waiting for the high oil prices to exert enough pressure, not just in terms of domestic US politics, but in terms of US allies who are really feeling the brunt of it, because they have to import American liquefied natural gas in response to this, which is crazy expensive for them. So the European states, Japan, these states are really ticked off about it because of how much they have to spend. And then you've got the poor countries like Sri Lanka, poor countries in Asia. Not only are they upset at the level of money, they're upset because they literally can't buy stuff at these prices and will have shortages of food and have famine and have kids coming to school underweight as a consequence of not being able to bring in food or to produce food at adequate volume and quantity over this. So there's going to be a lot of pressure on the US administration to make concessions. And this is why a lot of other countries around the world are saying that the president has lost and trying to generate a sense that the president has lost so that he'll make concessions. But conversely, the president has been saying in his negotiations with other states that it's the Iranians who should be made to feel that they've lost so that they'll make the necessary and relevant concessions. And this came up in the meeting with Xi Jinping, where he's trying to convince the Chinese to make the Iranians aware that they won't get any relief from the blockade by importing stuff from China, so that the Iranians will then feel the full pressure of the blockade. Because, of course, the Chinese have the capacity to send a lot of stuff to Iran and mitigate to a significant degree the severity of the blockade for them. So his pitch to the Chinese is if you don't want to pay a toll on the ships that go through the strait and you want this disruption to your energy supply chain to end quickly, and the Chinese have had to diminish by a significant percentage their oil and gas imports, and they've had to do without a lot of oil and gas, in the last couple of weeks in terms of imported stuff. They have a significant interest in getting the strait open. So they may, but the way that they would do it would not be by intervening militarily. It would be by making it clear to the Iranians that they don't have the source of economic support that they would expect to have. And the fact that the administration came out of that meeting thinking that that's even plausible would seem to suggest that the Chinese did not say that they were going to do everything that they possibly could to protect the Iranians from the effects of the blockade. But we'll see. It's very much a part of what causes war and hostility to happen is that the two sides don't know each other's willingness to tolerate suffering. They think that if they inflict a little bit of suffering on the other side will fold in response. And war goes on and goes on for a long period of time when the two sides really don't understand each other at all and do things to each other that produce very different responses from what they anticipate, which is why, the term hostile, comes from the Latin for stranger. War is something that people who are strange to each other do because they don't know what can be the basis of an agreement. They don't understand what terms for an agreement are actually possible. And so they start trying to create the terms under which an agreement could be had by fighting each other. Fighting is a way of getting to know somebody when they're really strange and alien to you. And that seems to me to be the situation we're in now. The United States has made the Iranian government even stranger than it was before by intervening in the content of its regime and produced a situation where nobody really knows how much suffering the other side is willing to bear. And so each side is waiting and convincing itself it should endure more pain on the basis that after a little bit more pain, surely the other side will fold. And each side has a tremendous propaganda apparatus going that is emphasizing to the hilt how much suffering it's causing for the other side in an attempt to persuade people who are living in or are influential in the politics of the other country to get the people who are in position to make the decision to give in. But so far, nobody has given in, and we're getting to the point where the midterms are going to be a lost cause. There's a window here where they could potentially, after 4 or 5 months, maybe get the strait back to its previous level of traffic. And by the midterm election, the inflation rate might cool off. That window in which they can do that before the midterms take place is shutting rapidly. And once it closes completely, they lose their incentive to give on anything because they're going to still have the economic consequences either way. And at that point, the logic flips and it becomes reasonable for them to become much more hardline.
Do you think we'd see a big blue wave?
Yeah. But at that point, the administration's attitude is, well, it's going to happen one way or another. At this point, the favorability number for Trump is down at like 38 on the averages, not any individual poll, but the averages, which take all of the polling into account. And at that number, under 40, it's really difficult to go into the midterm and not get slugged. He needs to be over 40 to have any chance of not getting slugged. And for a while, the argument was, well, he's still over 40. So he's not too far off. If he just catches a couple more points, he would be fine. But as it goes under 40 and the window for solving the energy crisis in time shuts, it's going to be really hard for him to find a peaceful way out. Because if he makes concessions, then he looks weak for having done that, which just further piles on the political defeat.
So, considering that this is his last term, unless we all end up dealing with him saying this is so unfair, I should have a third term, right? Let's say that this is his last term and he's accepted that. Might not be biological death, but it's political death in the sense that he will no longer be president. Um, is he a reversed or inverted Icaroo that he doesn't like? His version of it is he doesn't give a fuck anymore. He's not even concerned with placating his base. Again, saying, I don't care how any of this affects the finances of Americans. I just I don't see him saying that like even 6 months ago, certainly not a year ago. Do you feel like something has clicked on or off in him that, there's a kind of point of no return with him now?
It's possible that there's a little bit of an Icaroo thing going on with him. I think also in connection to the assassination attempt. It's possible. And I think also he is someone who never really figured Congress out. A lot of the stuff that he proposed to do in the first term required congressional support, which he never got. And he was badly embarrassed going into the midterm by looking to Congress to support things like repeal and replace or his infrastructure bill. And he never actually got the support for those things. And then, not only did he not get the support, but Congress spent the rest of his administration trying to impeach him. So he has never really developed a great relationship with Congress. And this has been increasingly a problem for US presidents. They can't produce a consensus behind the stuff that they want to do because at this point, there's too much division in the country for that. So it becomes very quickly an incentive for a lot of members of Congress to oppose whatever the president is doing. And once that happens, it becomes, it's much harder now in US politics to find a way around that. It used to be that you could get by it with corruption. So it used to be that what you would do is you would fill bills up with pork spending. So you would say to a member of Congress, I will create something in your district that's worth so much to you that people will reelect you. You'll be able to say, hey, look, I got the district this thing, and they won't care about the rest of it. They'll just be so happy that you got this thing. And it's, a tiny amount of money to the federal government, but it's transformative for your district to have some new thing there. This is no longer legally permitted, and it's one of the things that has really reduced the capacity of presidents to work with the Congress and diminished the incentive of the president to work with the Congress. So the president now tries to go around the Congress and see how much he can get away with in terms of executive activity. And so a lot of it becomes, instead of Congress having to approve it, it's the president tries it, and then the judiciary decides what to reject, with the Congress in an increasingly passive role. I think that this president in particular is very bad at managing Congress, as he's proven repeatedly over the years, and has become obsessed with just seeing what he can get the courts to permit and thinking that the justices that he picked in the first administration are his vehicle to potentially being able to do more now. But as he started to find, he can't manage the judiciary either. His tariffs, are not constitutional according to the judiciary. His attempts to get rid of birthright citizenship, that's not constitutional according to the judiciary. So he's accruing a lot of defeats at the judicial level as well. And I think at the midterms, he's going to lose more seats in the Congress and he's going to be really limited. And if he thinks that that's how it's going to go, especially all this talk about the war powers resolution and maybe, using legislation to tighten that up, what that does is it creates an incentive on him to act very quickly while he still has the power to act. If he thinks that the midterm is going to be a loss for him no matter what he does, then he starts trying to go really fast. And part of that going really fast is to try to have the maximum leverage at every point. So if anybody asks him if he has any concerns about anything Iran does, he will say no. He's not concerned about anything that they're doing. And he will minimize heavily any kind of capacity they have. He will use every possible rhetorical framing technique he can use to minimize the Iranian position, to try to get the Iranians to fold within the relevant unit of time. And the Iranians see that he's likely to lose the midterm, and that emboldens them to hold out. And so this is producing a very toxic incentive environment where everybody's holding out and assuming everybody else is going to fold.
Well, thank you for the insight into this situation. I mean, the way you're describing, the way that Trump is, it's like exacerbating this antagonism between the executive along with the congressional and the judiciary. Seems another step in towards further crisis of democracy.
Yeah, remember when he was running and all of these people thought he was going to do all this stuff? What does Make America Great Again mean? Great is the same as hope or change. It's an empty floating signifier. It can mean whatever you want. What version of America is the great version? It's whichever version you want it to be. And a lot of people in the administration, as soon as he actually got elected, started infighting about things like immigration policy. They all thought that they would be able to win the argument once he got in. And that's the hallmark of populism. Everybody who supports the populist says, don't worry, I know the populist. He's a really smart, reasonable guy. He'll listen to me once we get in. And then what happens? You get court politics, you get intrigue, you get infighting, and the people who think they're going to have influence rarely end up having it for any length of time. And you get very little done, and it certainly doesn't fit together in any kind of coherent way.
I know Trump. He would never do anything that would diminish or degrade Jesus Christ. Oh wait, what is this meme? Right, like these acts where he posts the meme where he's like positioned himself as Jesus. I mean, that really pissed off some people, some Baptists and some Pentecostals I know, and some Catholics I know. They did not like that, and they were sitting there going, "What is he doing? What like this is not." And whether it's him pissing them off or what about America first? Like, we don't go around starting wars unnecessarily, blah blah blah, and then the Iran thing, so he pissed those people off. It's just, it does. It seems like, hey, this is the end of. I'm coming to the end of it, and I don't care anymore. And I mean, look,
I think the final nail in the coffin will be inflation over 4%. It was 3.8 last month. I think the final nail in the coffin is inflation over 4%. Once it goes over 4, then he's got no incentive to wind this thing up because he's going to lose the midterm no matter what happens.
Okay. So, Benjamin, this has been absolutely fantastic. I absolutely love the way you unpack this for us. There's so much more in this, guys, but we got to some of the core deadlocks. And everybody, this one, end of the month, May 31st.
May 31st.
May 31st. Go pre-order it on Amazon. The paperback is coming out, very affordable. I am so happy that one of your books is now going to be affordable because I want as many people as I can help, to motivate to read your work. Because I just think you're one of the best political analysts we have. And I'm just so glad to have you here, Nance and I. Again, we've been waiting for this, and we really look forward to talking to you again soon. I mean, Nance, closing thoughts or?
I don't know. I think since we're talking about midlife crisis movies and Icaroo, and I don't think it's properly a midlife crisis movie, but Trump makes me think of Michael Douglas in Falling Down. And that's
I think that's a
kinda
midlife
scary.
crisis movie.
Definitely. That's definitely
Yeah.
a midlife crisis movie.
Yeah. I think I would prefer Icaroo to Falling Down, but I think we might be trapped in the Falling Down timeline.
Yeah. I mean, just so you guys know, Arrow Video is putting out an amazing 4K version of Falling Down this summer. So anybody who hasn't seen that movie, check it out. But Benjamin, like I say, I think we'll take a page out of Y Theory's book and say that the lesson today of all this is go watch Icaroo by Akira Kurosawa. And thank you so much for this, Benjamin.
Yeah.
Thank you guys.